The radar screen flickered with an impossible signature. 300 miles off the coast of Kandahar, something was painting targets that shouldn't exist. The air traffic controller's coffee grew cold as he stared at the green blip that defied every protocol in the book. Ghost 77, we're showing you as inverted at Angels 20, but you're requesting permission to land. His voice cracked through the radio static. The response came back crisp, professional, impossibly calm. Tower, Ghost 77 is right side up and coming in hot. You might want to clear the runway. That was the first time anyone heard the voice of Captain Zara, Phantom Volkov. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that she was flying a damaged F-22 Raptor with a dead hydraulic system, no ejection seat, and fuel bleeding from 3 separate punctures in her port wing. The impossible radar signature. She was flying inverted at 20,000 feet, using her aircraft's own radar reflection to mask her actual position from enemy surface-to-air missiles. In the next 17 minutes, she would single-handedly change how the United States Air Force thought about aerial combat, pilot training, and the very nature of courage itself. But first, she had to survive the landing. The tower fell silent as they watched her approach. The F-22 came in steep, too steep, its nose pitched at an angle that should have sent it into an unrecoverable dive. Instead, at the last possible moment, Volkov pulled what veteran pilots would later call the impossible recovery, a maneuver that existed only in computer simulations and fever dreams. The aircraft kissed the runway with the gentleness of falling snow, its remaining fuel vapors trailing behind like silver ribbons in the desert air. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft as the canopy popped open. What emerged wasn't the grizzled veteran they expected, but a woman barely 5'6", her flight suit soaked in hydraulic fluid and sweat, her dark eyes holding secrets that would reshape everything they thought they knew about air superiority. She stepped down from the wing with the casual grace of someone dismounting a horse, not someone who had just defied death and physics in equal measure. "Ma'am," the crew chief stammered, his clipboard forgotten in his hands. "How did you—" But Captain Volkov was already walking away, her helmet tucked under her arm, leaving only the smell of jet fuel and the echo of her boots on tarmac. Behind her, the F-22 settled into silence, its engines ticking as they cooled, bearing scorch marks and battle damage that told a story no one yet understood. 6 hours earlier, Captain Zara Volkov had been just another replacement pilot arriving at Bagram Airfield, her personnel file thin with carefully worded evaluations and transfer orders that raised more questions than answers. The other pilots had sized her up during the morning briefing, their glances carrying the particular brand of skepticism reserved for outsiders. "Another diversity hire," muttered Major Rick Bulldog Harrison, loud enough for half the ready room to hear. "Bet she washouts after her first real mission." The laughter that followed was the kind that builds walls between people, the kind that turns newcomers into targets before they've even had a chance to prove themselves. But Squadron Leader Colonel James Ironhawk Mitchell saw something different in her file. Buried between routine training scores and standard commendations was a single line that made him pause: tactical innovation under extreme circumstances. It was the kind of phrase that meant everything and nothing, the kind that appeared in classified reports that never saw the light of day. When he looked up at the woman sitting in the back row of the briefing room, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert, he recognized something he'd seen only a few times in his 20-year career. It wasn't confidence, confidence could be faked. It wasn't bravado, bravado got people killed. It was competence, pure and distilled, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. "Phantom," he said, using her call sign for the first time, "you'll be flying wing with Bulldog on today's reconnaissance sweep." The room fell quiet. Flying wing was usually reserved for experienced pilots, not newcomers on their first day. Harrison's face reddened, but before he could protest, Volkov stood up. "Thank you, sir. What's the mission profile?" Her voice carried just the slightest trace of an accent, Russian, maybe, or Eastern European, but her English was precise, professional. Standard patrol along the Pakistan border. Should be quiet. Mitchell watched her nod, watched her process the information with the kind of systematic attention that marked a natural pilot. What none of them knew was that quiet was about to become a memory. The morning sun painted the Hindu Kush mountains in shades of gold and amber as two F-22 Raptors climbed toward their patrol altitude. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio, professional but cold. Ghost 76 to Ghost 77 maintain standard separation. This isn't a training exercise, rookie. Volkov's response was equally professional. Ghost 77, roger that, maintaining separation. But in the privacy of her cockpit, she allowed herself a small smile. She'd heard worse from better pilots, and she'd outlasted them all. The F-22 responded to her touch like a thoroughbred horse, its fly-by-wire systems translating her intentions into graceful motion through the thin air at 30,000 feet. Below them, the landscape stretched out like a rumpled brown blanket, ancient and indifferent to the modern war machines carving contrails across the sky. For 40 minutes, they flew in formation, their radars sweeping the airspace in coordinated patterns, finding nothing but commercial traffic and the occasional transport helicopter. Then the world exploded into chaos. Ghost 76, I'm painting multiple bogies, bearing 270, climbing fast. Harrison's voice had lost its casual arrogance, replaced by the sharp edge of combat alertness. Volkov's radar confirmed what they were both seeing. 6 aircraft, moving at Mach 1.8, their radar signatures suggesting Russian-built fighters that had no business being in Afghan airspace. Ghost 77 confirmed, showing 6 bandits, probably MiG-29s. Her voice remained steady even as her mind raced through tactical possibilities. They were outnumbered 3-1, but the F-22's stealth capabilities should give them the advantage of surprise. Anyway. The lead MiG locked onto Harrison's aircraft with impossible precision, its fire control radar burning through the F-22's stealth coating like it wasn't there. They can see us, Harrison's shout split the radio frequency. How the hell can they see us? The answer came in the form of a Russian-accented voice on the emergency frequency. American stealth fighters, you are in violation of sovereign airspace. Surrender immediately or be destroyed. Volkov felt ice form in her stomach. Someone had given the enemy the F-22's radar signature. Someone had betrayed them all. The first missile launch lit up her threat receiver like a Christmas tree. Ghost 76, brake left. Sam launch, bearing 090. But Harrison was already turning, his aircraft pulling GS that pushed both pilot and machine to their limits. The S-400 surface-to-air missile streaked past his wing by mere feet, its proximity fuse failing to detonate only because of a manufacturing defect that saved his life. Volkov watched the near miss with the calculating eye of someone who had seen death before, and learned to measure the distance between survival and disaster in milliseconds. Multiple launch, the warning came from AWACS, their eye-in-the-sky controller whose voice carried the weight of someone watching disaster unfold in real time. 8 more missiles were climbing toward them, their rocket motors painting white lines against the blue sky. Harrison's aircraft was already damaged, hydraulic fluid streaming from his port wing, his flight controls responding sluggishly to his inputs. 7-7, I'm hit, taking heavy damage. You need to get out of here. But Volkov was already moving, her F-22 diving toward the deck with the predatory grace of a hunting falcon. What happened next would be dissected in classified briefing rooms for years to come. Instead of retreating, Volkov turned toward the threat, her radar painting the incoming missiles with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She fired her own missiles not at the enemy aircraft, but at the SAMs climbing toward them, creating a complex three-dimensional ballet of interception and evasion that existed at the very edge of what was physically possible. Ghost 77, what are you doing? Harrison's voice carried equal parts admiration and terror as he watched her aircraft weave between explosions like smoke through fingers. The radio fell silent except for the steady beep of targeting systems and the distant rumble of jet engines at full military power. In that silence, something changed. The new girl, the diversity hire, the rookie who wasn't supposed to understand real combat, was single-handedly keeping them both alive against impossible odds, and she was just getting started. Harrison's F-22 was dying around him. The hydraulic failure had spread to his secondary systems, and his flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Smoke was beginning to fill his cockpit, the acrid smell of burning electronics mixing with the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. 7-7, I'm going to have to punch out. Aircraft's not responding. His thumb hovered over the ejection handle, but before he could pull it, Volkov's voice cut through the static with absolute authority. Negative, 7-6. Stay with your bird. I'm going to get you home. What she did next violated every principle of aerial combat doctrine. Instead of maintaining safe separation, she flew her F-22 directly underneath Harrison's damaged aircraft, using her own plane's radar to mask his signature from the enemy fighters still stalking them. The two aircraft were now so close that their wingtips were separated by mere feet, both planes flying in formation so tight that a single mistake would destroy them both. 7-7, you're insane, Harrison whispered into his radio, but there was wonder in his voice now, the kind of awe reserved for watching someone rewrite the laws of physics through pure skill and determination. The MiGs were closing fast, their pilots confident that they had two crippled American fighters trapped in their web. What they didn't realize was that they were hunting a ghost who had learned to turn invisible not through technology, but through pure tactical genius. Volkov's aircraft disappeared from their radar screens, not because of stealth coding, but because she was flying in the radar shadow of mountains, using the terrain like a master conductor uses an orchestra. Every ridge, every valley, every outcrop of rock became part of her symphony of survival. Ghost Flight, this is Hammer 11, showing you as disappeared from scope. What is your status? The AWACS controller's voice carried professional concern tinged with growing amazement. Hammer 11, Ghost 77. We are flying nap of the Earth, maintaining radio silence until clear of threat zone. It was the last transmission they would hear from her for the next 40 minutes. What happened during that radio blackout would become the stuff of legend, whispered about in pilot-ready rooms and analyzed in war colleges around the world. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any legend could capture. For 40 minutes, Captain Zara, Phantom, Volkov flew a damaged F-22 Raptor through hostile airspace while shepherding another equally damaged aircraft to safety, using nothing but her own skill, her intimate knowledge of the terrain, and an understanding of aerial tactics that bordered on supernatural. She didn't just save Harrison's life, she redefined what it meant to be a fighter pilot in the process. When they finally emerged from radio silence, approaching the landing pattern at Bagram, the entire air traffic control tower had gathered to watch. Word had spread through the base like wildfire. The new girl, the one they'd all dismissed, had just performed a miracle. Harrison's aircraft touched down first, its landing gear barely functional, hydraulic fluid still streaming from multiple wounds. He managed to bring it to a stop just short of the barrier cables, his hands shaking as he shut down the engines. Volkov's landing was different. Her F-22 came in at precisely the correct angle, at precisely the correct speed, its touchdown so gentle that the aircraft barely seemed to notice the transition from flight to ground roll. She taxied clear of the runway with the casual competence of someone who had never doubted the outcome, even as ground crew rushed to inspect the battle damage that told the story of her impossible flight. As she climbed down from the cockpit, Harrison was waiting for her, his flight suit soaked with sweat and his face pale with the aftershock of survival. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had looked death in the eye and been pulled back by the skill of another. Volkov nodded, accepting the gratitude with the same quiet professionalism she brought to everything else. "Just doing my job, Major." But they both knew it had been far more than that. It had been a demonstration of what was possible when skill met courage, when training met intuition, when someone who had been underestimated decided to show the world what they were really capable of. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Intelligence officers pored over radar tracks and radio transcripts, trying to understand how 2 damaged aircraft had survived an encounter that should have been their death sentence. The official report would eventually classify most of the details, but the conclusions were impossible to ignore. Captain Volkov's tactical innovations had revealed critical vulnerabilities in enemy air defense systems, while simultaneously pioneering new techniques for combat survival that would be incorporated into pilot training programs within the year. Colonel Mitchell sat across from her in the classified briefing room, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the preliminary findings. "Captain, your actions today were—" He paused, searching for words that could encompass what she had accomplished. "They were unprecedented. The tactics you employed, the risks you took, by all rights, neither of you should have made it back." Volkov met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes reflecting none of the exhaustion that must have been pulling at her after such an ordeal. "Sir, with respect, there were no alternatives. Major Harrison needed support, and I was in position to provide it." It was then that Mitchell began to understand something about the woman sitting across from him. She didn't see her actions as heroic or extraordinary. She saw them as logical responses to tactical necessities. The kind of pilot who could think 3 moves ahead while pulling 8 GS in a combat turn, who could calculate fuel consumption and missile intercept angles while flying inverted through mountain valleys, who could turn desperate circumstances into strategic advantages through nothing but pure competence. She was exactly the kind of pilot the Air Force needed, and exactly the kind they usually drove away through institutional blindness. "There's going to be a formal investigation," he continued, watching her face for any sign of concern. "Anytime we lose stealth advantage, anytime classified systems are compromised, there are questions that need answers." She nodded, unsurprised. "Of course, sir. I'll cooperate fully with any investigation." But Mitchell was already thinking ahead, already planning how to protect an asset this valuable from the bureaucratic machinery that destroyed innovation in favor of conformity. "There's something else, Captain. There's talk of reassigning you to a test pilot program. Experimental aircraft, classified projects. It would mean a promotion and a chance to work with technology that won't exist in operational squadrons for another decade." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Volkov considered it with the same systematic attention she brought to everything else, weighing variables and calculating outcomes. "What would that mean for my squadron assignment here?" Mitchell smiled for the first time since she'd walked into the briefing room. "Captain, after today, you don't have a squadron assignment here. You have a squadron that would follow you anywhere." Outside the briefing room, word of her performance had already transformed the atmosphere on base. The same pilots who had dismissed her that morning now spoke her name with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Harrison had told his story to anyone who would listen, his account growing more detailed with each telling but never more dramatic. The truth was dramatic enough. By evening chow, she had acquired a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her career. She wasn't the new girl anymore. She was Phantom, the pilot who could disappear from enemy radar and reappear where impossible, who could turn certain death into tactical advantage through skill alone. But reputations, she knew, were fragile things. They could be built in a single afternoon and destroyed just as quickly by those who preferred their heroes to fit more comfortable stereotypes. As she walked across the flight line toward her temporary quarters, the weight of expectation settled on her shoulders like an extra piece of flight gear. Tomorrow there would be new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that today hadn't been luck or accident. Tomorrow she would have to do it all again, under the scrutiny of those who wanted her to succeed and those who still hoped she would fail. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of other sunsets in other places, other battles fought and won or lost in the eternal struggle between gravity and lift, between fear and skill, between what was and what was possible. She paused at the door of her quarters, looking back at the flight line where her F-22 sat among the other aircraft, its battle scars already being repaired by ground crew who worked with the reverence reserved for machines that had carried their pilots home against impossible odds. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new tests, but tonight, for just a few hours, she could rest in the knowledge that she had answered the oldest question in military aviation, not whether she could fly, but whether she could fight. The answer, written in hydraulic fluid and missile fragments across the evening sky, was yes. And that, she reflected as she stepped inside, was just the beginning. The investigation began 3 days later with a knock on her door at 0530 hours. Two officers in dress blues stood outside her quarters, their faces carrying the neutral expressions of people trained to reveal nothing. "Captain Volkov, we're from Air Force Office of Special Investigations. We need you to come with us." She had been expecting this moment since the debriefing ended, had been mentally preparing for the bureaucratic machinery that ground up pilots who dared to color outside the lines of established doctrine. "Of course," she replied, grabbing her cap and following them into the pre-dawn darkness. The interrogation room was exactly what she had expected: bare walls, uncomfortable chairs, and a recording device sitting prominently on a metal table. The lead investigator, a major whose name tag read Stevens, opened a thick folder and spread photographs across the table. Radar tracks, missile trajectories, satellite imagery showing the impossible path her aircraft had taken through enemy airspace. "Captain, we need you to explain how you knew to fly these specific routes. How you knew where the enemy radar coverage was weakest. How you knew when to break formation and when to maintain it." His tone suggested that he already suspected the answers, that he was looking for confirmation of conclusions already drawn. Volkov studied the photographs with professional interest, seeing her own tactical decisions rendered in black and white surveillance imagery. The flight path looked even more impossible from this perspective, a zigzag pattern through mountain valleys that seemed to violate everything they knew about enemy air defenses. "Major Stevens, I flew where the terrain provided cover. I used standard evasion techniques adapted to local geography." Her answer was technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. The full truth, that she had memorized every radar installation, every mountain peak, every blind spot in the enemy air defense network during her first week on base, would only raise more questions. "These weren't standard evasion techniques," Stevens pressed, tapping a photograph that showed her aircraft executing what appeared to be an impossible turn between two mountain peaks. "This maneuver here at this altitude, with a damaged aircraft providing escort, our pilots have been trying to recreate it in simulators. They can't do it." She looked at the photograph more closely, remembering the moment when physics and intuition had merged into something that existed beyond normal tactical doctrine. "Sometimes the situation demands innovation, sir. I adapted to circumstances as they developed." The questioning continued for 4 hours, each answer leading to new questions, each explanation revealing new mysteries about how a pilot with her limited experience could have performed maneuvers that veteran aviators couldn't replicate. But Stevens wasn't looking for military secrets or evidence of treason. He was looking for something far more valuable. He was trying to understand how exceptional performance could be identified, nurtured, and replicated across the entire Air Force pilot training program. By the time she was released, Volkov realized that the investigation wasn't about punishment. It was about promotion. That evening, Colonel Mitchell found her in the base library, studying technical manuals about aircraft she'd never flown, preparing for challenges that didn't yet exist. "Captain, we need to talk." She looked up from a manual on experimental propulsion systems, her expression politely attentive. "The investigation is complete. You've been cleared of any wrongdoing, but more importantly, you've been selected for a special assignment. How do you feel about test flying aircraft that don't officially exist?" The question hung between them like a doorway to a future neither of them could fully envision. She closed the manual and considered his words, weighing the implications of a career path that would take her away from conventional squadron life and into the shadowy world of experimental aviation. "Sir, what kind of aircraft?" Mitchell's smile suggested secrets within secrets, classified programs that existed in the spaces between what the public knew and what the future required. "The kind that will make your F-22 look like a prop plane, Captain. The kind that will redefine what we think is possible." It was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for her entire life, without fully realizing it. 3 weeks later, she stood on a runway in the Nevada desert, looking at an aircraft that seemed to have been designed by someone who had forgotten that gravity existed. The test pilot briefing had been classified at levels she'd never encountered. The technical specifications read like science fiction, and the performance envelope suggested capabilities that bordered on the impossible. "Welcome to Project Nightfall," the chief test pilot said, his weathered face carrying the kind of confidence that came from surviving flights that killed other pilots. "Hope you're ready to learn what flying really means." The aircraft, they called it the X-47 Wraith, looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black diamond, its surfaces flowing seamlessly from nose to tail without a single straight line or conventional control surface. As she approached it across the tarmac, she realized that everything she had learned about flight was about to be redefined. The cockpit was a hemisphere of displays and controls that responded to thought as much as touch. The engines generated thrust through principles she barely understood, and the flight characteristics existed in a realm where conventional aerodynamics merged with technologies that wouldn't be declassified for another 20 years. Her first flight lasted exactly 17 minutes and changed everything she thought she knew about the relationship between pilot and machine. The Wraith didn't just respond to her inputs, it anticipated them, reading her biometric data and translating her intentions into flight dynamics that existed at the very edge of what human consciousness could process. When she landed, her hands were shaking not from fear, but from the revelation that flying could be something far more profound than she had ever imagined. It could be a conversation between human intuition and mechanical precision, a dance between what was possible and what was necessary. The test program lasted 8 months, each flight pushing further into uncharted territory, each mission revealing new possibilities for what military aviation could become. She flew aircraft that could become invisible not through stealth coating, but through active camouflage, that could maneuver at speeds and angles that redefined combat tactics, that could operate in environments where conventional aircraft couldn't survive. With each flight, she felt herself becoming something more than a pilot. She was becoming a pioneer, exploring territories that existed at the intersection of human skill and technological possibility. But it was the final test flight that would define her legacy. The mission profile was simple in concept but impossible in execution. Fly the X-47 Wraith through a simulated air defense network that replicated the most sophisticated threats in the world, then return to base without being detected by any of the monitoring systems. It was the kind of test that separated competent pilots from legendary ones, the kind that would determine whether the entire program moved forward or disappeared into the classified archives of projects that almost worked. As she walked toward the aircraft for the last time, Volkov felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The skeptical glances from pilots who had dismissed her, the impossible rescue flight that had proven her competence, the months of test flights that had pushed the boundaries of what aviation could accomplish. All of it had been preparation for this single mission. She climbed into the cockpit with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose, who understood exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. The flight lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes, during which Captain Zara, Phantom, Volkov disappeared from every radar screen, every infrared detector, every sensor array that the most advanced military technology could deploy. She flew through air defense networks that had been designed to detect and destroy anything that moved through their coverage area, and she did it with such precision that the monitoring systems never registered that she had been there at all. When she finally appeared on approach to the runway, the test controllers realized they had witnessed something unprecedented. A perfect stealth mission flown by a pilot who had redefined what perfect meant. The debriefing lasted longer than the flight itself, with engineers and tactical analysts poring over every second of telemetry data, trying to understand how she had accomplished what their computers said was impossible. But the answer, she knew, couldn't be found in data streams or technical specifications. It could only be found in the moment when training met intuition, when experience merged with innovation, when someone who had been underestimated decided to show the world what was truly possible when skill met determination. 6 months later, Brigadier General James Mitchell stood before a room filled with the most senior officers in the United States Air Force, delivering a briefing about the future of military aviation. On the screen behind him was a photograph of Captain Zara Volkov standing beside the X-47 Wraith, her expression calm and professional despite the revolutionary nature of what she had accomplished. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the impossible become routine, "I want to introduce you to the pilot who will define air superiority for the next 50 years." The room fell silent as he continued, describing capabilities that sounded like fantasy, but were backed by classified test data that proved their reality. "Captain Volkov has demonstrated that the limiting factor in military aviation isn't technology. It's our own assumptions about what human beings can accomplish when they're given the right tools and the freedom to innovate. She doesn't just fly aircraft, she becomes one with them, turning machine and pilot into something greater than the sum of their parts." The photographs on the screen showed impossible maneuvers, perfect stealth infiltrations, tactical innovations that would reshape how air wars were fought. "She commands every man in this room," Mitchell concluded, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Not because of her rank, not because of her position, but because she's shown us what excellence looks like when it's freed from the constraints of conventional thinking. The question isn't whether we can afford to promote her. The question is whether we can afford not to." The silence that followed was the kind that accompanies paradigm shifts, the moment when old assumptions collapse and new possibilities emerge. 2 years later, Colonel Zara Phantom Volkov stood on the same runway where she had first landed a damaged F-22 Raptor, but everything had changed. The aircraft lined up behind her were unlike anything that had existed when she first arrived. Sleek, impossible machines that incorporated technologies she had helped develop through months of test flights that pushed the boundaries of what aviation could accomplish. The pilots she commanded looked at her with the kind of respect reserved for legends, but also with the comfortable familiarity of professionals who had learned to trust her judgment absolutely. "Ghost Squadron," she said into her radio, her voice carrying across the flight line to 12 aircraft that represented the future of air superiority. "Today, we're going to show the world what's possible when skill meets innovation. Remember your training, trust your instincts, and follow my lead." The acknowledgments came back crisp and professional, but underneath the military protocol was something else: pride, confidence, and the absolute certainty that they were following someone who had never led them anywhere but to victory. As her aircraft climbed toward the morning sun, Colonel Volkov allowed herself a moment to appreciate the journey that had brought her to this point. From the skeptical glances of pilots who had dismissed her as the new girl to command of the most advanced fighter squadron in military history, she had proven that excellence couldn't be categorized or constrained by other people's expectations. She had shown that the sky belonged not to those who claimed it loudest, but to those who earned it through skill, courage, and the relentless pursuit of what was possible. Below them, the earth spread out like a map of infinite possibilities, while above them, the sky stretched endlessly toward a future that would be defined by those brave enough to push beyond the boundaries of what had been done before. In that vast space between earth and sky, Colonel Zara Phantom Volkov had found her purpose, her legacy, and her place in the eternal story of human beings who dared to fly. The girl they had once underestimated had become the woman who commanded not just respect, but the very future of military aviation itself. And she was just getting started.